I am Emma Heggem. I am the managing editor for Future House Publishing, and I'm going to be our moderator today. Here with us, we have some lovely panelists. I'll let them tell you about themselves and their experience with editing books. You can kind of get the background that they're coming from, and then we'll dive into the topic. Allie, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'm Allie May. I write young adult fantasy. I have a bunch of fairy tale retellings published. My favorite one is in this book, and it's a Cinderella retelling where Prince Charming is a hopeless romantic who is determined to be part of the greatest love story of all time. So to make it more dramatic, he shoves Cinderella out of the ball, steals her shoe, and slams the door in her face. Because otherwise, the story would not be as meaningful and long-lasting as he wants it to be. I had a lot of fun writing that one.
Okay, awesome. And then Jared, do you want to go next?
Yeah, my name is Jared Abram Barneck, and I write just kind of suspense, urban fantasy, epic fantasy, some sci-fi, all kinds of things. You can find my URL right above my head. And I have a Trinity of Mind series, which is urban fantasy that takes place here in Salt Lake because nobody had ever written one. So I decided to be the one to do that. And check it out.
Awesome. Peter, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about you?
Sure. My name is Peter Orullian. I have an ongoing epic fantasy series from Tor. Fairly recently, I did a novelization of a concept album by a band by the name of Dream Theater, which is my favorite music group. And then right now, all of my time is dedicated to a new urban fantasy series that I'm co-authoring with Brandon Sanderson.
Cool. And last but not least, Lani.
Hi, I'm Lani Forbes. I also write young adult fantasy, and I currently have my Age of the Seventh Sun series with Blackstone Publishing. Book 1 came out last year. Book 2 comes out on Tuesday, which I'm really excited about, and Book 3 should be coming out next year in February as well. So it's a fantasy series based on ancient Mesoamerican mythology.
Fun. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about making passes for sensory, emotional, and relationship dynamics. So I wanted to start off with so for adding each of these rounds of things, when you start with like when you're adding sensory details, at what point in your editing process or your writing process do you specifically look for and pay attention to sensory details? Let's see. Lani, do you want to start us off this time?
Yeah, sure. Sensory details are definitely one of those things that I try to do very, very early, kind of in my first draft. Those are the things that I like to pay attention to specifically. Incorporating, like, especially when I'm setting a scene, that typically tends to be when I like to bring in sensory details the most. So like when my characters are moving into a new setting, or I'm starting a new chapter, or I'm establishing something new in the world. As I'm doing my first draft, I try really hard to make sure that I include as much sensory detail as possible. I tend to be like an overdoer with sensory detail, and then when I can go back and edit and I can pull things out and simplify. And my editor likes to always tease me, resist the urge to over-explain. So I like to put too much in at the beginning, and then I can go in and kind of take stuff out as I need. And I'm like, okay, we don't really need to know all of that. And so that's kind of how I tend to structure sensory detail.
Okay, awesome. Peter, how about you?
Yeah, I think, and this is something that I usually fail to do, because I'm eager to get to character and action when I'm writing. So I'll often not do enough at the front end of a chapter to set the scene. It's of course easy to go back and do that. I think, and one of the mistakes I think writers make is they'll often sort of checklist sensory detail and feel like they need to encumber the narrative with every sense. And I try and personally, I try and use the litmus test, that the same kind of litmus test you would for what a character would notice, which is, if your character is a carpenter and they're going into a place with new architecture, they're going to notice all the new architecture. If that's not something that you would notice as a character, putting all of it into the text, it's just going to groan under the weight of all the detail. So I think setting a scene is important. That's where you may err on the side of a little bit more to ground the reader. But I think mostly the guidance, at least my opinion is, the guidance on sensory detail is what's really salient to the moment. And it's not going to be all five senses all the time. I mean, I think that's an obvious statement, but I just think it's an easy thing to overdo.
Awesome. Jared, when do you worry about sensory detail in your books?
I'm a little opposite of the previous two. I'm basically writing to a green screen. I mean, I have like no background. Most of it's missing. And I'll finish what most people would call a first draft, and I'll go back in and there's not a single mention of setting. I mean, I know it's taking place outside, but I've described nothing. But I know the mood, and one of the things, I actually like getting my story out faster, and then I'll go back and add it in. So I'll expect to have like 120,000 word story, and I'll finish my story at 90,000 words with no setting. And then I'll go back in and I can describe it and add it. And I do a lot of what Peter said. I especially put the setting in at the start of scenes, what it looks like. I do like to put in, make the setting flow. I totally agree with Peter in that you got to know what the character's mood is. That's one of the things that I think is really important, is as you put the setting in, things they'll look at and the mood. So they don't just see something, they see it and it invokes a feeling in them. And that feeling should help with your tone. It should help with your mood. And what's the use of even describing the scene if you can't do something like that?
Awesome. Allie, what about you?
I am terrible at description. It is my writing weakness that my critique group says. So I rely very heavily on my writing group to point out my weaknesses there. They're always like, your characters are always naked. They're never wearing clothes. There's, I have no idea where they're standing. I don't know what these people look like. And unless it's like the entire focus of my narrator's attention in the moment, I don't include those until the second or third draft, because I am focused so much on getting, the story, the characters, just the plot, everything. And then I throw in the sensory details later. And sometimes it's not, sometimes I have to kind of correct myself and actively put it in. And I always end up I do a draft where I add and I over add. And then I do another draft where I have to condense. Sure. And then I do a third draft, then I have to do another draft to kind of find the happy medium between the two previous. And it works for me. It's kind of time consuming, but it works for me if I make specific passes just focusing on those details. It can go pretty quickly.
Okay, great. So if you have your original draft that either has too much sensory details or not enough sensory details, and you're going back now and editing this, what are some warning signs that you can notice for yourself that you might have too much sensory detail or not enough sensory detail? Does anyone want to start us off with that one?
I'll kind of jump into something that Peter said. I think it's really important to pay attention to what kinds of details you're including. So like I said, you don't want to just include the five senses because I want to check box and hit them. I want to make sure that the details I'm including have a specific purpose. Like he said, is this something that your character would notice? Why would your character notice this? Why would it be important? Or like I think Jared said of setting a mood, a specific mood. If I'm describing this particular scene, the details that I'm going to pick to keep. Because I'm definitely one of the over describers, and then I get rid of stuff I don't need. So I will specifically pick the ones that I'm like, okay, this one sets the kind of mood that I'm looking for. This one's really important because that's going to come into play later, or that's something that really means something to the character. So I think being very careful and specific about what details you do choose to include, because for me, they have to have a specific purpose of why you're including it and why you're including it right here.
The overdoing it has a negative consequence on pace. So, if you're spending a lot of time helping me understand as a reader what the color of a character's eyes are, or what the leaves on the trees look like, unless those things are germane to this story, either now or as foreshadowing, they turn out just to slow things down. So pace is not just a function of characters in action on the page. It's literally how, the information flow and how that goes. The best example I remember of this is James Patterson. People can debate his narrative skills, but the story goes that when he began his Alex Cross series, that he kind of very quickly just put down the bones of what that first novel was going to be with that character, with the intent to go back and then just flush it all out. What he realized was that it had something in the absence of all the stuff. And so he was much more judicious as he tried to fill in blanks. And the example he gave was he had Alex Cross as an investigator crossing the lobby of a hotel room, and he said, I could have talked all about what the hotel lobby was like. But first, it wasn't germane. And second, most of us have been in a hotel lobby. So we sort of do the mental gymnastics on our own. And so it's another layer of what you can do. Now, in second world fantasy, maybe there needs to be some more detail because you're doing more world building. But you still need to pick and choose, I think, because otherwise, a 300,000 word novel will become 500,000 words. And there's only about 2 people on the planet who can get people to pay attention for 500,000 words.
Anything to add to that, Allie or Jared?
No. They did a great job.
I had something I was going to say, and I didn't write it down, and I forgot. Thanks, ADHD. Oh no! I'm trying to think. I got distracted thinking about the hotel lobby.
Does anyone have any tips for when there's a sign that there's not enough? Because we've been talking about choosing, it's too much. But what about if there's not enough? What are some warning signs of that? Oh,
I remember what I was going to say. I was going to say I tend to be one of those readers who, and so a lot of times those big bulky paragraphs of description I skip over. And so one of the things I look for in my writing is I draft in Scrivener, and then I have to export it into Word or as a PDF or something, and I change the font so it looks different to me, and I am actually reading it and not just skimming it over, and my mind's just saying the words that it knows are on the page. And I will literally just scan it as if I am reading a book and just see how the pages look. Are the paragraphs broken up? Are they big or small? And that is usually a hint early on to me of whether or not something is missing from a page. It's not, like, obviously it doesn't matter in every single page, but when you're setting scene for a new chapter or a new setting, you need to have at least a little something. And so that's just kind of one of my tricks for looking really fast.
Yeah. I like to pick a chapter, I go chapter by chapter, and the first thing I do is check, is the scene set, right? Do I know where they are? Is everything, at least the important details? I like to go with what Peter says and not put everything in, but there might be one sense that's kind of important here. You should smell something when you step near the ocean. You should feel the humidity, right? But you don't always have to put every detail about, the beach or whatever it is. And, those things become important. I also look for keywords, such as the word ground. It sounds like a good word to use, but if you write the word ground in your book, you're not specific enough, right? It's what kind of ground? Is it dirt? Is it grass? Look for these like high level words that have so little meaning that they're not helping the reader get there. And look for those type of keywords, and you'll find them in all senses, right? He smelled something. Well, what did he smell? There's ground. Well, what does the ground look like? And sometimes you'll even fall to the ground and you're not describing, how it felt on their skin, or did it scrape their hand, things like that.
That's a great tip. All right. So let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about some of the other details that you can add into your draft. So they have emotional and relationship dynamics listed here separately, but I think probably those kind of go together pretty well as you're working in your book. So just kind of starting from scratch, you're writing your book. At what point do you start paying attention to the relationships and the emotions of the characters? Where is it helpful to you to worry about that, to add that in? Someone want to start us off, or should I pick somebody?
I want to tell a story real quick. In 2013, I was here at LTUE, and I stood up and I said at a panel, and I remember Larry Correia was on it. Peter, you might have even been on it. I don't remember everybody, but I think it was Larry Correia, Michael Brent Collings, and a couple other funny people, maybe Dan Wells. And they were just having a great time. And I do not have the skill of humor. So I just stood up and I'm like, hey, I don't know what happened. Maybe when God was creating my character, he rolled a 1 on humor, but I just can't make my books funny. And the crowd roared and just started laughing. And I remember Larry Correia stood up, or maybe it was Michael Brent. I can't remember which one, but they're like, you just made the entire room laugh. You can be funny. Just work on it. So I do a special pass for humor, because I know it's my weakness. And I think you should know what your weaknesses are and take time to do a special pass for them. And I am pretty good at dialogue, and I almost never have to go through and do a pass on my dialogue, but I have to do a pass on humor. And if I do edit dialogue, it's only to add humor in. So know your strengths and weaknesses. And
I wholeheartedly agree with that. As I said earlier, my weakness is description. And so oftentimes I have to go through even just chapter by chapter, doing multiple passes on a chapter at a time, trying to get, the sensory details. I have to sit and, I'm the kind of person who I have to make the face that my character is making so I can figure out how to describe it. Cause that just doesn't come naturally to me. And so I will sit and spend some serious time analyzing those kinds of things. Relationships, I usually have a basic idea of this is the relationship between these characters, kind of a character map. And usually my second draft is fleshing those out and getting those fully grounded, but sometimes they're still lacking because they're lacking the emotional, the sensory, those kinds of things are still lacking from them. And I find that even though I have to do them, I have to focus on them separately. It all comes together at the end, and it makes these relationships that much more realistic to the readers.
Yeah, I like the idea of kind of knowing what your strengths and weaknesses are, because I know for myself, one of my weaknesses when I'm writing is I will tend to forget to put the emotional responses of my characters to certain situations. Like if your character's going into a really scary situation, I'll sometimes forget to describe how my character is emotionally feeling or responding to that. So that's definitely a pass that I usually have to do. And I tend to rely very heavily on like you said, my critique partners, my agent is a very editorial agent, and I love her. I love working with her, but she knows that I have a tendency to forget emotional reactions to things. So she'll go in when I send her my hopefully as polished as I can get it draft of a book. I'll send my agent, and she'll go through and she'll just mark out what's her reaction here, what's his reaction here, and she'll just literally just go through and put need emotional reaction here, and she just kind of points it out to me. And I've been getting better at it, especially like noticing when there's a particularly big event happening, or when something that would be particularly emotionally distressing to this character. You start to kind of learn as you go certain situations where you want to make sure that you include the character's emotional reaction to this. And one of my favorite tools that I like to share with people, if you struggle with doing emotional reactions, especially like what emotional reactions feel like physically, I'll try to sit and think about like, how do I physically feel when I'm feeling that way? But there's a fantastic tool by Angela Ackerman called the Emotion Thesaurus. And if you haven't heard of that, I highly, highly recommend you check it out, because it's a really helpful tool of just, you can literally look up an emotion, and she lists out like what are common thoughts that a character might have if they're feeling this way, or what are common physical sensations that a character might have if they're feeling this way. And it's kind of like a little cheat sheet book. And I definitely I try not to rely too heavily on it, but if I'm feeling stuck or I need inspiration, or it's a really great place to kind of go and find that inspiration of like, oh yeah, sometimes when you're feeling this physically, your palms start sweating, or it might feel like this in your head. And so those are really helpful ways for me to kind of help bring in those emotional details, especially. It's just a really helpful tool. I highly recommend.
I would echo that, what I think I've heard some of the panelists say, maybe the most important, if it's not a superpower, I'm a believer that all writers have one, maybe two superpowers, and they can get good at other things, but there's something that's instinctive. For me, with Brandon, it's plot. It's not his magic systems; those are amazing. But Brandon's he came into the world as a superpower plotter. Guys like Rafus, he just has a facility with language. I'll read him just the way he puts sentences together. You can develop, I think, the other skills with work. So whether it's innate or something you work on, the emotional pass, I think, is one of the most important, maybe the most important. Couple of things there. One things that I think writers often don't use as a tool is what the character thinks, and that depending on what voice you're using, that's done different ways. But you can have the character think something and hear their thought, and oftentimes that's just italicized or something. Those usually aren't long, because most of us don't think in long, complete, constructed sentences. But those are a good glimpse into what a character is feeling. Another is, I think, maybe even more importantly, is what they do. Because I recently had an editor make a comment on a passage of a book where I had used some of the standard show don't tell stuff that all writers learn. And I don't know if this is new, and so the other panelists can say if they've heard of this, but it seems that one of the evolving techniques in narrative is to not use what they call emotional shorthand, like the rashing of the skin when you're scared or cold. These kind of physical responses, they are, I guess, increasingly being frowned upon. So what it means is the tools that are available to you to really make sure you drive home the emotional reaction on the page, there's plenty of them. But it seems to me the ones that are the most telling are what a character does. And that could be anything from combative to, somebody who is so depressed or sad or beaten that they can do nothing but sit down. These kinds of things just telegraph a ton of the interior of the character with just simple actions. And I think the advice about thinking about your own responses, is a very good one, because it's a way for you to get at an honest emotion.
Peter, I just got a comment. I love exactly what you're saying. What they do, how do they act? So one of the things that you'll see in a lot of early writers is they'll say, he is angry. And then they'll fix it by saying, oh, that uses a to be verb. He felt angry. I fixed it. No, you didn't. And then they'll be like, he grimaced in anger. Okay. And then they're like, no, I fixed it. And what you said before is sometimes that's not enough. And it's becoming less and less enough to just have like a grimace. You know, what did he really do? You know, in one scene, I have characters holding a paintbrush and he squeezes it until the paintbrush handle cracks, right? And that's a little bit, you know, more descriptive. But on top of that, you need a little consistency. So when you do write something like that, note it in your character page. When he does this, he acts this way. And then you'll start getting consistency throughout your story. Because you don't want someone reacting to anger in 10 different ways. It makes it really hard for the reader to follow.
And a little trick with that too can just be imagining. I heard someone describe it once of imagining like a movie scene, because you can't tell if the character's heart is pounding by watching the movie scene, and you can't tell, you know, nobody's narrating like he felt very angry in this scene. And so I try to picture, like, if I were watching a movie or if I were watching a play, how would this actor communicate to me what they're feeling? And a lot of that is by doing certain actions. And another good resource that talks a lot about that too is The Emotional Craft of Fiction by Donald Moss. That's a really good book where he talks about kind of those nuances of how do you show emotion through different ways other than just like physical descriptions. And he talks about just kind of, that nuanced, more difficult, advanced way of showing how someone's feeling about something without, just straight out telling.
I also think this goes back to what Peter said about knowing your character and what they would focus on in the moment. What they would see it also applies to how they would react, what they would feel. And a lot of times I have to ask my writer friends or my husband or my sister, whoever, I have to ask them and say, okay, what would you do in this situation? To try and gauge different responses from different people. So that way not all of your characters are reacting to the same things in the same way. Some people, it's a fight or fight instinct thing. Some people get really riled up and other people get scared and run away. And you kind of have to figure out and, keep those notes on your character. My characters I keep notes of like nervous habits that my characters have. So like one character is constantly playing with her hair, not like constantly throughout the book, but you notice that early on, so that way I can use it as a cheat. In the last couple of chapters of the book during the big confrontation, she's sitting there twirling her hair, and the narrator, because she's not the narrator, and the narrator notices and is like, hey, don't be nervous. And it's just kind of an easy trick for me to use. And I think the emotional thesaurus can help you kind of find those different reactions, and just seeing different perspectives, I think, because I was on the panel earlier about neurodiversity, and a bipolar person is not going to react the same way as an autistic person, or someone with ADHD and anxiety, things like that. They're all going to react in different ways to those things, and the way they even feel those emotions is going to be different.
Yep.
I think that's where understanding, like I said, personalities is so important, especially with your characters. I'm a huge lover of the Enneagram. It's personality typings. It has like kind of like 9 different personality types, and I love studying that. I'm working on a master's in psychology, so that's probably partly why I enjoy that kind of stuff. But understanding that, different personality types of different characters are going to respond differently emotionally in different circumstances. So if you have someone that's a more avoidant personality, if they're in a really stressful or scary situation, they're going to pull back, they're going to want to withdraw, they're going to want to run, versus a character that maybe has a more like get in there and fight kind of personality. And so they're going to be more aggressive instead of, retreating. And so understanding your characters so well will kind of help give you ideas of what kinds of behaviors are going to manifest with certain emotions. Yeah, so I love that you pointed that out.
I have a friend who, before she even begins drafting her book, she does Myers-Briggs tests for all of her characters. And then she has them all written down for each character, and then she looks it up, and she can kind of use the research done on people with those personality types to then give her kind of a cheat sheet on reactions and emotions.
Yeah, or even people I know, like if I know someone who's a certain personality type, I'm like, how would this person respond in this situation? Oh, they would totally do this.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, for me, it's helpful, like comparing them to as real people if I can. But like, yeah, knowing like, oh yeah, this type of person tends to respond this way.
It's funny. Everything we're bringing up is all pre-writing. The more you do in pre-writing, the better you're going to do when you write your novel. The more you know about your character, when you actually go write it, you're going to put all that stuff in correctly, and it's just going to flow better. Mm-hmm. Character sheets and pre-writing for characters is extremely important.
I do a lot of that myself, where I do a lot of plot work, understanding characters. But I would want the people who are listening to this to know that there's no golden approach. Two of the best writers I know, George Martin and Stephen King, don't do anything. They just sit down and begin to craft a story. Now they have an advanced skill set, and they have some muscle and some instincts that serve them well. And that's okay for you to do it that way. I think earlier in your career, if that's how you approach your craft, you may do more rewriting, and in a field that is increasingly being pushed to produce content and product, then it's taking you more time to get to a finished product. I hate to make it sound so commercial, but there is an element of it where you're trying to get new stories out and build momentum in a career. But having said all of that, I think there are very useful tools. And by the way, I don't know that even for the same writer that there's one golden approach. I don't know about the other panelists, but I've written books where I did just inordinate amount of pre-work, and then I have written novels where I really just had a single character or a single image, and it grew from there. And I think both are valid.
I do that with every story is different. My Cinderella retelling that I was telling you about, I think that story went through 3 drafts total, because the idea of the story, the concept of the story was so clear in my head that filling in all the little details was so easy. And I had never had that happen before. Every other story I write, the details are just kind of vague. It's what's in the background. I don't know. How's this person feeling? Kind of sad, I guess, And on the draft that I just turned into my critique group, I literally, it's such an early draft, and it's almost entirely dialogue with little filler bits in there, because I needed to get the dialogue down and get it to my critique group so that they could then look at it and be like, hey, yeah, this is actually good. This is a good story. Your characters are good. And I'm like, okay, so this is worth writing. All right, good. So yeah, every draft is different. Every story, every character is different.
I heard
and
just one quick thing. Not too long ago, I heard Patrick Rothfuss say that he was on, I think, draft 87 of a particular novel. So, and he's had pretty good success with his approach. So
my novel's on draft 50 something.
There you go. No, I don't know that's.
And I think, I think every writer does it in their own style, and I think, like you said, that's totally fine for each of us. And like I'm not good at sitting down and writing out character sheets and doing analysis, but I always do it in my head, and I hold that in my head. And so but I know some authors that have notebooks, that do Myers-Briggs personality tests with their characters and that kind of stuff. So I think a lot of it is your own personal style and figuring out what works for you, for sure.
And sometimes you have to work on a couple of different ideas in order to figure out what works for you. Sometimes, you have to put something aside and move on to the next one in order to go back and fix whatever wasn't working.
Mhm.
All right. So we have about 15 minutes, and I am sure people have very specific questions about this topic. So I'd love to open it up to questions and see what the attendees are specifically interested in hearing more about now.
Clara asks, do you have a resource or know of a resource of adjectives or words that carry a specific mood?
That would be a great resource to write. I don't know of one. When I want a mood, I just think of the mood and I have to find the words for that mood. I could make use of such a resource myself.
I spend a lot of time either like on thesaurus.com or even on Pinterest. You like type in the word for the mood, see what pops up, because like Pinterest is such a visual thing. See what pops up and see what words pop into your mind. Sometimes you can even find resources of just like lists of words that people have made that are like ways of saying, or ways of, different words for angry, different words for, scared. And a lot of them I didn't think about before I saw them. And then I'm like, oh, I'll save that for later. I might need that again.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I just the first one I can think of that kind of roughly it might have to do with that is Angela Ackerman, the author of the Emotion Thesaurus. She also has some really good ones on settings. She has like an urban setting thesaurus and a rural setting thesaurus, and that might be a good jumping off point too if you're looking for certain descriptions to set a certain mood with a particular setting. So that might be a helpful resource to start with.
I think the question also was asking about adjectives, and adjectives are the latest casualty of new narrative, is what I like to say it that way, because it wasn't so long that adverbs became the enemy of the writer, and I don't hold with that advice for adverbs and adjectives. I do think that they can be a crutch, but there's the argument I think is just untenable that there is not good use for adjectives and adverbs to set apart how you really mean, for someone to say something, because someone may say, hey, screw you, and he said, well, if I don't know more about how that's said, I can think of 12 ways that one statement could be articulated. So, I don't know that there's a specific resource. And I do think that the unfortunate circumstance, I was just lamenting this the other day. I remember the time when I heard a new word and I got excited because I would subscribe to emails on new words to learn. And then I started to realize as I was adopting those in my writing, I was getting lambasted by editors and other, writer critiques. And it's because, the average reader doesn't use some of those words. So it became not useful anymore. And that's more of a soapbox of my own. But, to the question, I think that I would encourage aspiring writers not to throw out adverbs and adjectives, to use them judiciously. But then when they do them, that can be that much more impactful.
I agree with Peter.
I also think writers groups, other writers, can be a really helpful resource. Don't be afraid to ask for advice from your writer friends, from people who have read your stuff. How would you write this scene? How would you describe it? And obviously don't take their stuff word for word, but let it spark some ideas that you can then bounce off of each other until you figure out what you want to say.
Yeah, and I would also say be wary of a source like that and using it as a crutch, because there's a lot of ways to show emotion. So I alliterate a lot, and I like to use cacophonous sounds, and none of that is, going to be found in just the adjective use. You need to find different things, put the words together. I write a lot of poetry, so maybe that's a skill I have, but there's other ways to show emotion besides adjectives. There's other ways to make something feel harsh besides adjectives. And I think that's why there's a pushback on them. I agree with Peter, though. When used correctly, they should be used. But there's just other tools, and don't get caught using only one tool.
Yeah, and study other writers that you really admire. I know one of the things that I like to do is if I'm reading another author and I see that they set a mood really, really well, I'll actually like kind of step back and study like, whoa, how did they do that? And like, how did they use language, or how did they use a symbol here? Or how did they set the mood, and how did they create this really beautiful description in this way? And I like to study other authors that I admire. I learn a lot that way, especially at the beginning.
I want to, before we move on, I want to sort of second and add to Jared's comment about poetry. I think one of the most useful things that a writer can do to improve their economy of language and their accuracy is to read poetry. So much better if you can write poetry. I think writing poetry is really hard. The old adage says something like, the short story writer does what the novelist can't, and the poet does what the short story writer can't. And it has also the benefit of, I think it makes your language more beautiful, and I'd never think that's a bad idea. So if you're not reading poetry at least a little bit as part of how you're trying to just grow your craft, I think you're missing a huge opportunity.
All right, do we have another question?
Lisa asks, how do you write emotional reactions without repeating yourself over and over?
That's something I'm still trying to actively learn right now. So yeah, I would love to hear what the other ones have to say too.
Well, I think repeating yourself is fine if it's building the character and helping you identify them. It becomes a distinct feature of them, but you can repeat too much. So there's a nice balance, like I was saying earlier, when someone gets mad, they're going to behave a certain way. Make sure you note that, and you know how they behave. Well, every time they get mad, they should repeat that, and that shouldn't necessarily be wrong, but they also have a character arc. So you can actually use that by showing how maybe they didn't get quite as angry. Maybe they're working on their anger, or maybe their anger is getting deeper, and so they react more each time, right? So there's lots of things you can do. It's hard to pick one thing.
I was going to say, in my novel that I'm on the 50 whatever draft of, I was getting a lot of feedback from my critique group that, yeah, I was repeating this one thing a lot. And it's the basis for the plot of the story is my character has these powers that she's not supposed to have, and she's trying to keep them a secret, and she cannot control them. And so I was starting to build up a physical, like there's a physical buildup of her losing control of her powers before she can't control them anymore. And I had to come up with some different ways to describe it in the first 3 chapters to kind of set this up so that way at the end of the book I could pull little cue words from there to throw in at the end, towards the end in the climax, so that I could keep the pace moving. And it's hard, and it took multiple passes, and I had to ask for advice, bounce ideas off of friends, the thesaurus. And sometimes I ended up having to cut out a couple of the scenes from the book that I didn't think, I thought they needed to be in there. And I ended up, I did that overriding thing, and then I ended up cutting it out and condensing it until it didn't disrupt the flow and it wasn't sounding repetitive. but it still got the same idea across. And it just takes different, you got to work on it multiple times. You got to, thesaurus, writer friends, all those resources.
Yeah. One strategy I've been using is trying to use the setting in the story, especially because I tend to write fantasies in like other worlds and that kind of stuff. And so if I'm trying to describe an emotion or something and I'm can't find like a unique way to say it, sometimes I'll try to use a metaphor based on the setting. Like, for example, I'm kind of working on like a Western inspired fantasy right now. And so when she gets shocked with something, instead of just saying like, her heart pounded or something, I try to say something like, it felt like she took a rifle to the chest, or like, like the butt of a rifle to her chest or something. And so trying to incorporate aspects of the setting and how maybe some interesting ways I can come up with metaphors with what's going on in the story at that time or in the setting at that time, and see if I can use that to kind of help vary and make things a little more interesting.
There was some discussion about characters, and if you have a character, it seems to me that one of the techniques is, as you establish a character's reactions, and it doesn't only have to be anger; it could be all the things. Once you've done that, you kind of have set up for yourself your own shorthand for later. So there doesn't have to be as much language in service of the character's reaction, because we already know as a reader how the character is going to feel about something, or when they're feeling something, what that feels like for them. So I think that, like in the book I'm working on now, there's a lot of emotional stuff right at the very beginning. And so I worked really hard to get that as distilled as I could, but still spend enough time on it so that I fixed it in the reader's mind. Now I kind of have this technique, or this ability later in the book, when I want to have this exact same emotional reaction, I can get it. All I have to do is get a couple of keywords relative to what the reader already knows about the character's emotional response to something. So I know that that's kind of abstract, but I think that's an easy enough principle for someone to apply, so that they're not having to, every time the character is angry, spending a bunch of time talking about exactly how they feel angry.
I like how you said shorthand.
And descriptions don't have to be long. If you can find the right words, I think this is what we were going along with adverbs and adjectives and using them carefully. If you can find the right word, it can be very, very quick. Like you said, the butt of the rifle. That's something that we can all kind of picture that. We can almost feel that. And it doesn't have to be this long, drawn out description of whatever. It can just be, quick.
All right, we are almost out of time. Does everyone want to, real quick, just like final thoughts? Maybe let people know if you're going to be able to answer questions in the chat later, or what panel you have next. Let's start with Peter.
I would just say that it seems to me that with most books, what readers sort of, their callbacks later are the character and the emotional reactions they have. So if you're going to spend time on extra passes on a book, really dialing in memorable characters, which is usually has a relationship with the emotional core of the novel or the story, are primary. All of the other stuff's really important. I don't want to marginalize it, but those are the things that are going to get people remembering your fiction, I think.
Lonnie?
Yeah, along the same lines, I'm a firm believer in that the purpose of story is to elicit emotion. And so just making sure that when you go back for passes, what are ways that you can maximize that emotional impact, whether that's through sensory details that elicit emotion, or through certain relationship dynamics that elicit emotion, or through vicariously living through your character and what they're experiencing, so you're experiencing along with them. I think it all comes down to ensuring that your reader has an emotional experience. And so how can you maximize those other tools in order to make sure that they have kind of the max emotional experience that they can have with your story.
Jared.
Yeah, I wrote an article called Write Like a Painter in Layers in like 2012, and it's still on my blog. So if you go to this URL right above my head and just search for Write Like a Painter, you'll find it, and it covers like all these different passes you can go through. And if you add it to what you've listened to today, it's going to really benefit you as an author in what you're writing.
Allie?
My final thoughts would be, let yourself fail a couple of times. It doesn't have to be perfect right away. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. Otherwise, you'll never get to the end. You'll never get past that block. And sometimes you just have to take some space and, go for a walk, go, cuddle an animal, go read something else, go watch, a movie or TV, something like that, and leave it simmering in the back of your mind. My husband did a presentation at 9:00 this morning about being creative, and it talks about the incubation period for ideas and how essential that is, that you just let it sit in the back of your mind and develop without actively trying to work on it. And sometimes that's just what you need.
Awesome. Okay. That is all the time we have for our panel today. So thank you, panelists, for all your wonderful thoughts and expertise.
Thank you so much for having us.